The camera holds on a calendar, a red circle around the date. Party. The shot widens to a sprawling, immaculate backyard, sunlight glinting off a crystal-clear swimming pool. A man, his face a mask of cold fury, stands beside a large pump. He connects a thick hose, his movements precise and deliberate. The low, ominous whir of machinery cuts through the morning's quiet. A voiceover, calm and chilling. They took my peace. They claimed my sanctuary. And now, they were going to have a party. A close-up on the pool's surface, a single ripple, disturbing the calm as the first torrent of water roars into a storm drain. A distant, carefree laugh from next door echoes, oblivious to the coming silence. The pool level drops, revealing a growing, gaping chasm, the water now a vengeful whisper. Mark was a man of routines. He woke at 5, drank a strong black coffee on his back patio, and watched the sunrise paint the sky over the still, placid surface of his swimming pool. The pool wasn't just a pool. It was the final, hard-won prize of his new life. After 25 years of marriage that had soured into a bitter, draining coexistence, his divorce had been a brutal, soul-shredding affair. He'd lost half his savings, half his furniture, and more than half his faith in humanity. What he had gained, however, was this house, this backyard, this pool. It was a blank canvas on which he had painted his new, solitary, and blissfully quiet existence. He'd spent the last 2 years restoring the property, his hands calloused and his back aching from the labor. The pool had been his magnum opus, a cracked, algae-choked mess when he'd moved in, now a glistening jewel of turquoise water, surrounded by smooth, warm flagstone and neatly trimmed boxwoods. It was his morning plunge, his evening respite, the place where he finally, truly felt at peace. That peace, however, was about to be shattered by a force far more invasive and entitled than the memories of his ex-wife. It had a name, and it lived next door. The Millers had moved in 6 months ago. Karen Miller was a woman in her early 40s with a perpetual look of aggrieved confidence, her blonde hair perfectly coiffed, her voice a piercing instrument of passive-aggressive entitlement. She had a 17-year-old son, Liam, who was a carbon copy of his mother's arrogance, only with a teenager's boundless, self-centered energy. Their arrival had been marked by a series of small, irritating intrusions. It started with the basketball, a cheap orange plastic monstrosity that would regularly sail over the low chain-link fence separating their yards, landing with a loud, hollow thud on Mark's meticulously manicured lawn. The first few times, Mark had retrieved it, walking over and handing it back with a polite smile. "Sorry about that," Karen had said the third time, not bothering to make eye contact as she pulled weeds from her flower bed. "Liam's still getting used to the hoop." Mark had simply nodded, but the apologies dwindled. Soon, Liam and his friends would just hop the fence to grab it, leaving a small divot in the lawn each time. Mark would watch from his kitchen window, a knot forming in his stomach, the quiet anger simmering beneath his calm exterior. He had bought this house for its privacy, not to be a thoroughfare for the neighborhood kids. The real trouble began a month later. Mark was watering his hydrangeas when he saw it. A group of Liam's friends, all boys with shaggy hair and loud voices, had set up a folding chair right next to the chain-link fence. They were tossing a football back and forth across a thin strip of grass, their feet inches from his property. Their conversation loud and peppered with profanity. "Excuse me," Mark called out, his voice firm but not aggressive. The boys stopped and stared. One of them, a lanky kid with a baseball cap turned backward, just grinned. "What's up, man? Could you guys move your chair, please? It's on my side." Of the fence. The lanky kid looked at the chair, then at Mark, then back at his friends, a smirk spreading across his face. "Nah, it's cool. We're just hanging out." Mark felt the blood pressure in his temples spike. He walked over to the fence a few feet away. No, it's not cool. That's my property. I'd appreciate it if you'd keep your stuff on your side. Before the kid could reply, Liam appeared from the back door of his house, a phone in his hand. He walked towards the fence, his head tilted slightly, an expression of studied nonchalance on his face. Dude, what's the problem? The problem is your friend's chair is in my yard, Mark said, his voice now colder. Liam glanced at the chair, then at Mark. Chill out, man. It's just a chair. Mom said it's fine. Mark's jaw tightened. Your mom doesn't get to decide what's fine on my property. Take it and please don't do it again. Liam, with a theatrical sigh, ambled over and kicked the chair, sending it tumbling back into his own yard. Whatever, he muttered, loud enough for Mark to hear. Old man's got to stick up his ass. Mark stood there, the anger a hot, nauseating wave. He had spent his entire marriage trying to be the bigger person, to avoid conflict, to keep the peace. It had cost him everything. He wasn't going to do it again. Not in his new home. He went inside and called the police, not to report a crime, but to ask for advice on how to handle a boundary dispute. The officer who answered, a bored-sounding woman, suggested he put up a no trespassing sign, and if the problem persisted, to call again. The next day, Mark installed a small, tasteful sign near the fence line. It was an act of quiet defiance. Karen, seeing it from her window, stormed out to her backyard. What is this, Mark? She demanded, pointing an accusatory finger at the sign. It's a sign, Karen. It says, no trespassing. Trespassing? For what? A basketball? A chair? My son and his friends are good kids. They're on my property without permission. I've asked them to stop. They didn't. This is the next step. The next step? Are you serious? This is so petty. You know, you're just a miserable old man who doesn't want anyone to have fun. You have a huge pool you never use, and my poor son has to play basketball in a tiny backyard. It's not fair. This was the first time she mentioned the pool. Mark felt a tremor run through him, a premonition of the storm to come. My backyard is not a public park, Karen, and my pool is not for your son's use. We'll see about that, she snapped, a venomous glint in her eyes, and walked back inside, slamming her sliding glass door. For a week, things were quiet. Mark almost let himself believe the sign had worked. Then, on a sweltering Saturday afternoon, he heard it. Splashing. Laughter. Shouts. The sounds of a summer party. He was in his study, working on his laptop, and the noise was impossible to ignore. He walked to the window, the knot in his stomach now a tight, suffocating fist. There they were. Liam, his friends, and a few of their girlfriends, all in his pool. They were jumping off the diving board, throwing a beach ball and yelling at each other, their bodies cutting through his carefully maintained water. The sight was a punch to the gut. The violation was so complete, so brazen, so total that, for a moment, Mark just stood there, stunned. This wasn't a mistake. This was a takeover. He walked out the back door, the screen door slamming behind him, a sound that seemed to silence the world for a brief, tense second. Hey! He yelled, his voice hoarse with shock and fury. Liam, who had just come up for air, after a dive, looked over, his eyes widening for a split second before they narrowed with a familiar entitled glint. He climbed out of the pool, water dripping from his hair and shoulders. Yo, Mr. R, he said, using the casual, annoying moniker his mother had invented for him. What's up? What's up? Mark repeated, his voice dangerously low. What's up is, you and your friends are in my pool. Uninvited. Get out. Now. Whoa, chill out, Liam said, holding his hands up placatingly. Mom said it was cool. She said you said we could use it when you weren't home. It was a lie, a bald-faced fabrication. Mark looked past him, at the teenagers who were now scrambling out of the pool, their fun instantly killed by the presence of a furious adult. He locked eyes with a girl, her face pale, who seemed genuinely ashamed. The others just looked annoyed. Liam, Your mom never said that, Mark said, his voice shaking with the effort of control. And even if she did, it's not true. This is my property. You need to leave. All of you. Now. Liam shrugged, a flicker of genuine cruelty in his eyes. Whatever, dude. It's just a pool. You're being super weird about it. Get out, Mark roared, the dam of his composure finally breaking. Get out of my yard now! The teenagers, sensing the real anger now, gathered their towels and phones, whispering to each other as they hustled out through the miller's back gate. Liam was the last one to leave, walking slowly, deliberately. He stopped at the gate, turned, and looked at Mark. You're pathetic, he said, his voice laced with the kind of teenage contempt that feels like a physical blow. This is lame. You're lame. Mark stood alone by the pool, his sanctuary now feeling tainted and violated. The water was still moving, disturbed by their presence, and a half-eaten bag of potato chips lay on his flagstone patio. He felt a deep, profound sadness mixed with a boiling rage. He went to his phone and called Karen, who answered on the third ring, her voice chirpy. Hey, Mark, what's up? Don't what's up me, Karen, he said, his voice still trembling. Your son and his friends were in my pool. Without permission. Again. He said you told him it was okay. There was a pause on the other end of the line. A long, telling pause. Oh, Mark, she said, her voice now dripping with faux sympathy. I'm so sorry, I told him he could use. The pump roared, a deep, guttural sound that was loud enough to be heard across the yard, but probably not over the miller's excited party planning. The thick hose shuddered and then tensed, and from the pool a violent, steady torrent of water began to gush. It wasn't a gentle drain. It was a deluge. Mark watched, his heart a cold, hard stone in his chest, as the level of the water, his beautiful, hard-won sanctuary, began to drop. The sound was a roar of fury, of betrayal, and of a long-overdue retribution. He knew they couldn't see this from their patio, not yet. They wouldn't know until the water was gone. The hose throbbed, a lifeline of liquid leaving his life, and a dark smile, the first honest one he'd worn in weeks, spread across his face. He watched as the waterline revealed the dirty, slightly stained tile beneath, a blank canvas awaiting its next, more devastating act. The sun climbed higher, beating, down on the cul-de-sac. Mark stood guard by the pump, his mind clear and focused. The roar of the machinery was a soothing symphony to him, a cleansing sound that was washing away weeks of quiet rage. He had positioned the pump and hose in such a way that the torrent of water was aimed directly into the storm drain on the street, minimizing the splashing sound. He occasionally heard a burst of laughter from the miller's backyard, a flash of Karen's voice, a snatch of music. They were still oblivious, still planning their invasion. He felt no guilt, only a profound, cold sense of purpose. The pool was almost half empty now. The waterline had dropped to the point where the shallow end was just a few feet deep, a muddy, pathetic puddle. The diving board, once a symbol of joyous, carefree play, now jutted out over a growing, gaping chasm. The air, which had once felt heavy with the scent of chlorine and summer, now smelled of damp earth and stale concrete. The beautiful, sparkling jewel of his yard was becoming a desolate, ugly pit. A car pulled up to the miller's house, a pristine, black SUV with tinted windows. A group of teenagers piled out, all dressed in expensive-looking swim trunks and bikinis, carrying duffel bags and coolers. Liam's friends. They were early. Mark's heart rate quickened, a flicker of nervous, adrenaline shooting through him. He watched them from behind a large potted plant, a silent observer in his own yard. They walked around to the miller's backyard, their excitement palpable. He heard Liam's voice. Yo, guys, just hang out on the patio. Mom's got the food coming. The pool's all ours. Just go on in. A chorus of excited shouts and laughter. Mark, held his breath, waiting. He imagined them walking to the edge of the patio, their eyes scanning for the shimmering turquoise water. He imagined the confusion, the dawning horror. He didn't have to wait long. A sudden, sharp silence fell over the miller's yard. The excited chatter stopped abruptly, replaced by a single high-pitched gasp. Then another. A teenaged boy's voice, laced with disbelief, called out, "What the hell, man?" Mark heard Liam's voice. "What? What are you talking about?" The sound was closer now, heading towards the chain-link fence. Mark stepped out from behind the plant, his hands on his hips, his expression unreadable. He looked at the fence, at the open, gaping void where his pool had been a few hours earlier, and then at Liam's face. The look on Liam's face was pure, unadulterated shock. His jaw was slack, his eyes wide, staring at the empty pool. The bravado, the teenage swagger, was completely gone. In its place was a look of raw, humiliating disbelief. He stared at Mark, his mouth working, but no words coming out. "Surprise," Mark said, his voice flat. Karen, drawn by the sudden silence, emerged from her back door, a bowl of chips in her hands. "What? What's going on, Liam? Why isn't anyone in?" "The pool?" she asked, her voice tinged with annoyance. She walked to the fence, her eyes following the line of Liam's horrified gaze. The bowl of chips slipped from her hands, clattering to the flagstone with a sickening crunch. The chips scattered everywhere, a pathetic beige explosion against the brown stone. She stood there, frozen, staring at the drained pool. The look on her face was a masterpiece of entitled fury. Her mouth opened and closed soundlessly, like a fish out of water. Her face, usually so perfectly made up, was a mask of furious, disbelieving rage. "What have you done?" she shrieked, her voice a sonic assault. "What is the meaning of this?" Mark gestured to the pump, still roaring, and the powerful stream of water gushing out of the hose. "I'm draining my pool, Karen. It's a bit of a spring cleaning. A summer cleaning, I suppose. I'm getting rid of some pollutants." "Pollutants?" she screamed, her face turning an alarming shade of crimson. "Are you out of your mind? My son is having a party today, a senior party. You psychopath! You did this on purpose!" "You're right," Mark said, his voice calm, his eyes steady. "I did. You and your son claimed my pool. You told your friends you were having a party here. You have been disrespecting my property, my privacy, and my boundaries for weeks. And when I asked you to stop, you just got louder." You can't do this," she yelled, her words thick with fury. "This is insane. You've ruined everything. Liam's party. This is bullying. It's harassment." "It's my pool, Karen," Mark said, a cold edge entering his voice. "I can fill it. I can empty it. I can pave it over and turn it into a parking lot. It's mine. Something you and your son have seemed to forget." Liam, who had been standing there in a state of stunned silence, finally found his voice. "Dude, you are so messed up. You're a psycho. My whole party is ruined." "Your party," Mark said, turning his cold gaze on the boy, "that you plan to have in my yard, in my pool, without my permission? Yes, I suppose it is. I'm sorry to have interfered with your plans to steal my property. But then again, I'm not." Karen grabbed her phone from her pocket, her fingers shaking as she dialed a number. "I'm calling the police!" she spat, her eyes narrowed to furious slits. "You've committed an act of malicious vandalism and property damage. You're going to pay for this. You're going to pay for all of this." "Be my guest," Mark said, his calm unwavering. "I'll be right here, draining my pool. Feel free to have the party in your yard, Liam. It's got a great view of an empty hole." The teenagers who had arrived for the party were now gathered at the miller's side of the fence, their phones out, recording the unfolding drama. Their whispers and muffled laughter only added to the humiliation of the moment. Liam, his face flushed with shame, turned and ran into the house. A few minutes later, a police cruiser pulled up to the curb. Karen, still screaming into her phone, hung up and pointed an accusatory finger at Mark. "There he is, officer! The psycho who just maliciously destroyed his own property to ruin my son's party." The officer, a young man with a tired expression, and a name tag that read Officer Ramirez, got out of the car. He looked at Karen, then at Mark, then at the half-empty pool. He took in the roaring pump and the gushing hose. It was a bizarre scene. "Ma'am, what exactly is the nature of the complaint?" he asked, his voice slow and deliberate. "He's draining his pool," Karen screeched. "He's a menace. He's doing it on purpose to ruin my son's party. He's a total psychopath." Officer Ramirez turned to Mark, his expression unreadable. "Sir, is that your pool?" "It is," Mark said. "And are you draining it?" "I am." "And you're doing this intentionally to prevent the party?" Mark nodded. "They've been trespassing on my property for weeks. I've asked them to stop. They refused. They told their friends they were having a party here. They claimed my property as their own. I decided to remove the thing they were claiming." Officer Ramirez looked at Karen, whose face was now a deep, mottled purple. "Ma'am, he has a right to drain his own pool. It's on his property." "But it's malicious. It's harassment. It's a waste of water," Karen insisted, her voice cracking. "He's just doing it to be mean." "Ma'am, being mean is not a crime," the officer said, his tone still painstakingly patient. "He's not trespassing on your property. He's not damaging your property. He's not breaking any laws. You and your son were planning a party on his property without his permission. That would be trespassing. So, legally speaking, he is well within his rights." Karen stood there, dumbfounded, her mouth agape. The police officer, the symbol of authority she had always assumed would be on her side, had just sided with the enemy. The pump continued to roar, a loud, undeniable monument to Mark's triumph. The teenagers at the fence, now fully engrossed in the drama, were all filming the scene. And then, more cars pulled up. They were coming for the party, a whole caravan of them. Liam's friends, dozens of them, were all getting out, their phones. In their hands, their faces alight with the promise of a big celebration. They saw the police car, the screaming woman, the silent man, and the giant, empty hole in the ground. One of them, a girl with long blonde hair, walked up to the fence, her face a mixture of confusion and pity, and looked at Liam, who had just come back outside, his face ashen. "Dude," she said, her voice filled with quiet, mortifying shock. "You didn't tell us this was happening." Liam didn't say a word. He just stood there, his back to the empty pool, his entire world crashing down around him. The triumphant roar of the pump filled the silence, and Mark, watching the entire beautiful spectacle unfold, felt a profound, satisfying peace. The pump continued to roar, a loud, undeniable monument to Mark's triumph. The teenagers at the fence, now fully engrossed in the drama, were all filming the scene. And then, more cars pulled up. They were coming for the party, a whole caravan of them. Liam's friends, dozens of them, were all getting out, their phones in their hands, their faces alight with the promise of a big celebration. They saw the police car, the screaming woman, the silent man, and the giant empty hole in the ground. One of them, a girl with long blonde hair, walked up to the fence, her face a mixture of confusion and pity, and looked at Liam, who had just come back outside, his face ashen. "Dude," she said, her voice filled with quiet, mortifying shock. "You didn't tell us this was happening." Liam didn't say a word. He just stood there, his back to the empty pool, his entire world crashing down around him. The triumphant roar of the pump filled the silence, and Mark, watching the entire beautiful spectacle unfold, felt a profound, satisfying peace. The aftermath was a symphony of chaos and humiliation. The police officer, having delivered his verdict, shook his head and drove away, leaving Karen fuming at the curb. The caravan of partygoers, their hopes of a poolside bash dashed, stood in a bewildered huddle, filming with their phones and whispering. Liam, now a viral sensation on his own social media channels, stood rooted to the spot, his face a ghostly white, the weight of his public shame a physical presence. The quiet roar of Mark's pump was the only sound that cut through the teenage, murmuring. Within 20 minutes, the crowd of kids dispersed, their laughter and excitement replaced by an awkward, embarrassed silence. They peeled out of the cul-de-sac, their cars filled with the kind of subdued gossip that cuts deeper than any shouting match. Karen finally stalked back into her house, her sliding glass door slamming with a final, desperate force. Liam remained. Outside for a moment, staring at the empty pool, his teenage bravado completely shattered. He looked at Mark, his eyes filled with a potent mix of hatred and defeat, before walking slowly, his shoulders slumped, into his house. Mark let the pump run until the last drop of water had been siphoned from the pool, leaving nothing but a large, gaping crater of exposed concrete and slightly stained tiles. The diving board, once a symbol of summer fun, now hung over the abyss like a defeated arm. He turned the pump off, and the sudden silence of the cul-de-sac was deafening. He was finally, truly, at peace. But peace, he knew, was a fragile, fleeting thing. He was dealing with a wounded ego, and a wounded ego, particularly one as grand as Karen's, was not something that healed quietly. It retaliated. That evening, Mark was scrolling through his laptop when his phone buzzed with an alert from the neighborhood social media group next door. A post had been tagged with the word urgent. He clicked on it. The headline was a masterpiece of melodrama. Attacked by neighbor, my son's senior party ruined by malicious maniac. The post was a long, flowery, and entirely fictional account of the day's events. Karen's version. She wrote of a grumpy, unhinged man who had viciously and maliciously drained his pool, which she claimed he had offered for community use, to ruin her poor son's milestone party. She posted pictures of the empty pool, calling it an eyesore and a safety hazard. She ended with a plea for the community to stand with her against a bully and a sad, lonely old man. Mark sat back, a wry smile on his face. She hadn't even mentioned the part where the police officer sided with him. The comments were already rolling in. Some were sympathetic. "That's terrible, Karen. So sorry to hear that." Some people are so cruel. A few, however, were skeptical. "Didn't that pool belong to him, Karen?" one read. Another asked, "Why didn't you just have the party in your yard?" Mark took screenshots of every comment, every post. He wasn't going to get into a mudslinging match online. He was going to let her bury herself. The next morning, the new wave of harassment began. Mark woke up to the sound of music blaring from a stereo in Karen's backyard, a repetitive, bass-heavy rap song that rattled his windows. He walked over to the back patio and saw Karen and Liam sitting on their patio furniture, sunglasses on, a speaker blasting at full volume. They glanced over, a look of smug satisfaction on their faces. Mark, unfazed, walked back inside, grabbed his own speaker, and started playing a classical music station at an equally loud volume, placing his speaker as close to their fence as possible. The two warring soundtracks created a bizarre, dissonant mess that eventually, after 2 hours, led Karen to turn her music off in a huff. Mark, with a final, victorious swell of a Mozart symphony, turned his off as well. The petty war continued. He found trash on his lawn, empty beer cans, fast food wrappers. He found his doormat gone one morning. He installed a security camera, a small, discreet one that gave him a clear view of the fence line and his back patio. He had learned from his first mistake. He was going to document everything, but Karen's biggest weapon was her community presence. She wasn't just posting on Nextdoor, she was talking to every neighbor she knew. Mark started to feel the social chill. People who had once waved to him in the morning now averted their eyes. Mrs. Henderson, a sweet elderly woman from 2 doors down, now hurried inside whenever she saw him. He was becoming a pariah, a sad, lonely villain in a story he had no control over. He knew he had to act. He had to stop playing her game and start playing his own. He looked at the gaping empty hole in his backyard, no longer a symbol of victory but of a quiet, stubborn defiance. He went to the local hardware store and bought several bags of mulch, some landscaping fabric, and an array of hardy, fast-growing plants, vines, grasses, and ferns. Over the next few days, he transformed the empty pool. He covered the concrete with the landscaping fabric, a weed barrier. He filled it with a thick layer of mulch. He began planting the ferns and grasses along the bottom, creating a kind of sunken garden, a beautiful, unconventional oasis in the middle of his yard. The vines he planned would eventually grow up the sides, covering the stained concrete, turning the former symbol of his torment into a unique and beautiful defiance. His new project drew more curious looks from the neighbors. The initial horror of the empty pool was replaced by a kind of bewildered fascination. It was odd. It was weird. But it wasn't a wasteland. It was his. Just as he was finishing his last planter, a letter arrived in his mailbox. It was an official envelope bearing the logo of the Homeowners Association. Mark, his hands still dirty from the mulch, opened it with a sense of grim expectation. The letter was formal and to the point. It stated that based on a formal complaint and community feedback, his property was in violation of community guidelines regarding general maintenance and aesthetic standards. It cited the unsightly and hazardous condition of the emptied swimming pool and gave him 30 days to remedy the situation by refilling or otherwise returning the area to a state of reasonable repair or face escalating daily fines. Mark read the letter twice, his face impassive. He looked at his new, beautiful sunken garden, his defiant work of art. The final sentence, "This is not a suggestion but a formal directive," seemed to mock him. Karen had lost the battle with the police, but she had just opened a new, more powerful front in the war. Mark's cold, hard victory was now in jeopardy. But as he looked at the official letter in his hand, a slow, determined smile spread across his face. This wasn't a defeat. This was a new challenge, and he knew exactly what his next move would be. The aftermath was a symphony of chaos and humiliation. The police officer, having delivered his verdict, shook his head and drove away, leaving Karen fuming at the curb. The caravan of partygoers, their hopes of a poolside bash dashed, stood in a bewildered huddle, filming with their phones and whispering. Liam, now a viral sensation on his own social media channels, stood rooted to the spot, his face a ghostly white, the weight of his public shame a physical presence. The quiet roar of Mark's pump was the only sound that cut through the teenage murmuring. The letter from the Homeowners Association, bearing the sterile weight of officialdom, was Mark's new battlefield. Karen had lost the battle of wits and law enforcement, but she had weaponized the bureaucracy. Mark looked at the letter again, its legalese a formal insult to the quiet beauty of his sunken garden. The HOA demanded he remedy the unsightly and hazardous condition of his swimming pool within 30 days. He knew this was a direct result of Karen's campaign, a victory she was likely savoring with a bitter, triumphant grin. Mark, however, was no longer a man of quiet resignation. He was a man of cold, methodical defiance. He didn't throw the letter in the trash. He placed it on his desk and began his research. He pulled up the HOA's bylaws online, a dense, mind-numbing document full of stipulations on everything from paint colors to lawn height. He read every line, every clause, looking for the specific wording Karen had used in her complaint. He found nothing in the bylaws that explicitly forbade a garden in a former pool, nor any specific definition of what constituted an unsightly condition beyond standard lawn maintenance. He realized the letter was based on a subjective complaint, not a clear violation of a rule. This was his opening. Over the next week, as he meticulously crafted his response, Karen's petty harassment escalated. She started parking her car just past his driveway, forcing him to make a difficult, multi-point turn to get out. He simply took a photo of it and sent it to a few of his neighbors with a polite but pointed email, just in case anyone else has trouble getting out of their driveways. He received 2 polite replies and one from a man named John, 3 houses down, who wrote, "She's been doing that to me too. It's a pain." Mark found an ally. He and John, a burly, good-natured man in his 60s, started talking over the fence. John had a calm, rational perspective on the whole affair. "She's a menace, Mark," he said, shaking his head. "She's always got some kind of complaint. Your garden looks beautiful, by the way. Better than a big pool that's just a breeding ground for mosquitoes." John's support was a balm to Mark's spirit, a reminder that he wasn't alone, and that not everyone was drinking the Karen Kool-Aid. Mark finished his letter to the HOA. It was a masterpiece of calm, logical argument. He cited specific clauses from the bylaws that didn't apply, and he proposed a new term, xeriscaping, or landscaping in a style that requires minimal water. He argued that his sunken garden was not only not a hazard, but a unique, beautiful, and environmentally friendly solution. He attached photos of the thriving plants and the artistic layout he had created. He ended his letter with a polite but firm declaration that he would not be removing the installation and would challenge any fines levied against him. The letter, sent certified mail, was his opening salvo. The next battle would be in person. The HOA board meeting was scheduled for the end of the month. The night of the meeting, the community center was packed. Karen, surrounded by a small group of sympathetic neighbors, sat in the front row, a triumphant, almost theatrical smirk on her face. Liam was there as well, looking sullen and still mortified, but sitting in solidarity with his mother. Mark sat in the back with John, a manila folder in his lap. The meeting started with routine business, but everyone in the room knew what the main event was. Finally, the board president, a harried-looking woman named Brenda, cleared her throat. "We have a dispute to resolve regarding a property on Elm Street," she said, her eyes glancing nervously from Mark to Karen. "The complaint regards the condition of the pool at—" She trailed off, not wanting to say Mark's address. "Mrs. Miller has filed a complaint, and Mr. Rinaldi has submitted a response." Karen stood up, her face a mask of practiced outrage. "This is an outrage. He's a menace to the entire neighborhood. He drained his pool in an act of pure, unadulterated malice to ruin my son's party, and now he has a giant gaping hole in his yard that's a safety hazard and an eyesore. What if a child falls in there? What if it collects rainwater and becomes a breeding ground for disease? He should be forced to fill it or face fines." She spoke with a performative passion, gesturing wildly at the air. The room was silent. Then Mark stood up. He walked to the front of the room, his movements calm and deliberate. He didn't shout. He didn't make accusations. He simply opened his folder. "Madam President, members of the board," he said, his voice even. "I've submitted a full response. As you can see from these photos, my former pool is now a thriving, sunken garden. It is not an unsightly condition, but a form of xeriscaping, a landscaping method encouraged by our very own state in times of drought. Furthermore, it is not a hazard. A child is far more likely to drown in a filled pool than to be injured by falling into a dry garden. Mrs. Miller's claims are not based on the bylaws, but on personal animus stemming from the fact that her son repeatedly trespassed on my property." He laid the photographs of his beautiful garden on the table, and the board members leaned forward, their expressions shifting from concern to genuine interest. He then laid out the screenshots of Karen's next-door posts, the screenshots of the text messages from his own son to his friends, and the timeline of the harassment. Karen jumped up, her face contorted with rage. "This is a lie! He's a liar! He's obsessed with me!" Brenda, the president, held up a hand. "Mrs. Miller, please. Mr. Rinaldi has made his case. The board will now deliberate." The deliberation was short. They huddled together, whispering. Mark could see them passing the photos of his garden around, their faces registering a kind of pleasant surprise. They then looked at the screenshots of Karen's rantings, their expressions hardening. Karen sat in her chair, a coiled spring of fury, glaring at Mark. Finally, Brenda stood up. She looked directly at Karen, her voice firm. "Based on a thorough review of the bylaws and a visual inspection of the property, the board has determined that Mr. Rinaldi is not in violation. His sunken garden is not a hazard, and it is not an unsightly condition. The complaint is denied." The words hung in the air, a final, unassailable defeat. Karen's face went slack for a split second, then snapped back into a mask of pure incoherent fury. She opened her mouth to scream, but the words were stuck in her throat. She looked around the room, her eyes darting from face to face. But she saw no allies. The neighbors who had once whispered their support now looked away, embarrassed by her public meltdown. Liam, his head in his hands, was staring at the floor. Mark, without a word, stood up and walked out of the community center. He didn't need to gloat. He had won. The war was over. He had his sanctuary back, and a new, unexpected peace had descended over his life. As he walked out into the cool night air, he heard the faint sound of Karen's voice, now a high-pitched, lonely wail, from the empty room. It was the sound of a total, final, and absolute defeat. The letter from the Homeowners Association, bearing the sterile weight of officialdom, was Mark's new battlefield. Karen had lost the battle of wits and law enforcement, but she had weaponized the bureaucracy. Mark looked at the letter again. Its legalese a formal insult to the quiet beauty of his sunken garden. The HOA demanded he remedy the unsightly and hazardous condition of his swimming pool within 30 days. He knew this was a direct result of Karen's campaign, a victory she was likely savoring with a bitter, triumphant grin. Mark walked out of the community center and into the cool night air, the sound of Karen's furious, defeated wail echoing behind him. He didn't look back. The victory felt complete, total, and profound. He had not just won a battle. He had won the war. He had his sanctuary back. The hollow rage that had been simmering in him for weeks had finally, blessedly, dissipated, replaced by a quiet, deep sense of peace. He returned home, the lights of his own house a beacon of welcome. He walked to the back patio and looked out at the empty space where his pool had once been. His sunken garden, a testament to his resilience, was now just a quiet, beautiful thing in the moonlight. He sat down in a chair, a sigh escaping his lips, and for the first time in a very long time, he felt completely at home. The HOA's verdict, once official, spread like wildfire through the neighborhood. Karen's public, humiliating defeat had broken the spell of her authority. The whispers that had once been in support of her now turned against her. People who had once waved to Mark now stopped to talk to him, offering congratulations. John, his new friend, brought him a cold beer, and they sat on the patio, talking about everything but the drama of the past weeks. Mark was no longer a pariah. He was a hero, a man who had stood up to the neighborhood bully and won. Karen's reign was over. The silence from her backyard was a stark contrast to the weeks of loud music and incessant noise. The petty acts of harassment stopped completely. The quiet was a kind of new sound, a relief he hadn't realized he was missing. He saw her once, pushing a shopping cart full of groceries, her head held high but her shoulders were slumped, and her face was pinched. She saw him, but she immediately averted her eyes, walking quickly into her garage without a glance. Her power, he realized, had been entirely based on the illusion of control. Now that the illusion was gone, she was just an angry, lonely woman, The final undeniable sign of his victory came on a Friday afternoon, 2 weeks after the HOA meeting. Mark was working in his garden, pruning some of the vines, when he heard a familiar sound. A truck, and voices he hadn't heard in weeks. He looked up. Liam and his friends were in their yard. They were carrying boxes out of the house and loading them into the back of a large moving truck. The silence of their departure was more profound than any noise they had made. There was no fanfare, no shouting, just the quiet, methodical movement of people packing up their lives. Liam, his face still etched with the humiliation of the party, caught Mark's eye from across the yard. For a split second, their gazes locked. There was no anger, no hatred, just a quiet, sober acknowledgement of the past. Liam gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture that spoke of a lesson learned, before turning back to the truck. Mark returned to his garden, the sounds of his neighbor's departure a fading memory. He watched as the truck pulled away, and a few moments later, a man came out of the miller's front door and planted a small red sign in the center of their lawn. It was a simple sign, one that everyone in the neighborhood knew well. Mark sat on his patio, a cup of coffee in his hand, watching the last rays of the afternoon sun hit the newly placed sign. The story had come to an end. His pool was now a garden, his antagonist was moving away, and his home was, once again, his sanctuary. He was a man of routines, and his routine was finally his again. He took a sip of his coffee, a gentle, satisfied smile on his face, and looked out at his new, beautiful, and utterly peaceful backyard.